In the pre-dawn dark of December 16, 1944, a German officer sat down to write his after-action report. His hand was not steady, not from the cold. He had just watched wave after wave of his own paratroopers thrown back from a hillside held by a mere 18 American soldiers, and he could not make the arithmetic make sense. 500 men against 18, something close to 20 to 1. It should have taken 30 minutes. It took an entire day. That report still exists in the archives today, and what it forces us to confront is one of the most extraordinary small unit stands in the history of the American Army, a stand that history books reduce to a single paragraph, buried on the very first day of the Battle of the Bulge. 18 young men, a frozen ridge above a Belgian village called Lanzerath. No orders to hold, no reinforcements coming, and an enemy convinced this would be the easiest fight of the entire offensive. They were wrong, and by the time the sun went down, those 18 Americans had done something so unlikely that the German command itself could not explain how it happened. This is their story, told through the words of the men who tried to kill them and failed. The Ardennes forest in December of 1944 was supposed to be quiet. That was the word the reports kept using. Quiet, and the word that actually traveled down through the chain of command was simpler still. Rest. This was where exhausted divisions came to recover after the brutal fighting in the Hurtgen forest, and where green divisions came to get their first taste of the front without too much risk of dying from it. The 99th Infantry Division, newly arrived from the United States, had been given a long, thin stretch of the line along the German border precisely because nobody in Allied high command expected anything to happen there. The front here was stretched far wider than doctrine considered safe, with only a handful of divisions covering ground that called for many more. The gaps were enormous. The forest was ancient and dark, fir trees standing shoulder to shoulder in rows that swallowed sound, and in some places an entire platoon could vanish into the tree line and never be seen from 100 yards away. Into one of those gaps, on the 10th of December, went 18 young men who did not belong to any rifle company. They were the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, a specialized unit whose job was never to hold ground. Their job was to watch it, to report what they saw, and to disappear before trouble found them. They were, by design and by training, the eyes of the regiment, not its fists. Their commanding officer was First Lieutenant Lyle Bouck, and he was, by the standards of most armies in most wars, absurdly young for the responsibility resting on him, 20 years old. A St. Louis boy who had enlisted at 17, lying about his age to get into a peacetime army that did not yet know it was about to fight the largest war in human history. He had trained hard, studied harder, and risen through the ranks with a seriousness that unsettled some of his men before it earned their respect. He did not smoke. He did not drink with the others in the evenings. He read field manuals the way other young men read pulp novels, and more than one veteran sergeant in his platoon had grumbled, early on, about taking orders from a boy who looked barely old enough to shave. But Bouck had something else, something harder to name, a stillness. An unwillingness to accept an assignment at face value when his own eyes told him something different. Around him were men who had come to trust that stillness. Technical Sergeant William Slape, the platoon's senior non-commissioned officer, a farm boy with an unhurried competence that steadied younger soldiers just by standing near them. Private First Class William Chronicles, whose family had come from Greece and who had grown into the kind of soldier other men wanted beside them in a foxhole, calm under pressure, in a way that could not be taught in any training manual. Private First Class Risto Milosevic, quiet and watchful, the sort of man who noticed things before anyone thought to ask him what he saw. They were none of them professional soldiers in the sense of men who had chosen the army as a calling. They were farm boys and factory boys and college boys, most of them barely out of high school, thrown together by a war none of them had asked for, and bound to each other now by something stronger than orders. The days leading up to the 16th had a strange, suspended quality to them, the kind of quiet that presses on the nerves precisely because it refuses to explain itself. Men wrote letters home by the weak light of a shielded flashlight, describing a war that felt, for the moment, almost dull. They joked about Christmas, about packages that might or might not arrive from home, about the absurdity of spending the holiday season freezing in a hole in the ground on the edge of a forest in a country most of them had never heard of before they shipped out. Beneath the jokes, though, something else moved. A restlessness nobody could quite name. Men who had learned, in only a few weeks at the front, to trust the quality of silence the way sailors learn to trust the quality of wind. And this silence did not feel like the silence of an empty sector. It felt like the silence before something. The platoon dug in on high ground above a small Belgian village called Lanzerath, a scattering of stone farmhouses and a single crossroads cafe, sitting almost precisely on the border between Belgium and Germany. From their position on the ridge, they could see the road running north out of the village, the road that led, eventually, toward the Meuse River and beyond it toward the heart of Allied supply lines. Nobody told them this road mattered. Nobody, in the second week of December 1944, seemed to think much of anything in this sector mattered. Attached to Buch's platoon, sharing the same stretch of frozen earth, was a small forward observation team from the 371st Field Artillery Battalion, 4 men under Lieutenant Warren Springer, whose job was to call in artillery fire on any target worth the ammunition. 22 men total, dug into foxholes on a hillside that Allied intelligence had rated as one of the quietest postings on the entire Western Front. The nights were bitterly cold that week, cold enough that water froze solid in canteens left outside a foxhole, cold enough that men rotated watch in shifts of an hour because any longer risked frostbite. Buch's men had heard rumors, the kind that travel through every army in every war, unconfirmed and half-believed. Engine noise at night, somewhere across the German lines. Increased radio traffic. A German prisoner, taken days earlier in a nearby sector, had spoken under interrogation about a coming offensive, a large one, though nobody at regimental headquarters seemed inclined to take the claim seriously. The line had been quiet for months. Quiet, it seemed, had become its own kind of proof that nothing would change. Buch was not so certain. On the night of the 15th of December, he sent a message up the chain requesting permission to pull his platoon back to a more defensible position, closer to the rest of the regiment. The request was denied. Hold the line. Maintain observation. It was, in the language of a peacetime army pretending the war had a rhythm it could schedule, business as usual. At 5:30 in the morning on the 16th of December, business as usual ended forever. The sound came first as a distant tremor, felt in the chest before it was heard by the ears, and then it built into something that no man in that platoon, veteran or not, had ever experienced. Some 1,600 German artillery pieces, gathered in secret over the preceding weeks along an 80-mile stretch of front, opened fire simultaneously. The horizon to the east turned orange and then white, flash after flash rolling together into a single continuous glow, and the ground itself seemed to shudder under the men huddled in their foxholes above Lanzerath. This was the opening of what German planners called Operation Autumn Mist, what history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge, Adolf Hitler's last great gamble in the West, a desperate attempt to split the Allied armies in two and force a negotiated peace before the war reached German soil. None of the 18 men on that ridge knew any of this yet. What they knew was that the earth was screaming, and that somewhere in the darkness to the east, an offensive of a scale nobody in Allied command had predicted was tearing itself loose from months of secret preparation. The barrage lasted roughly 90 minutes before falling silent, and in the sudden quiet that followed, Buch's men strained their eyes toward the tree line and the road below, waiting to see what the silence had been clearing the way for. Word came over the radio of explosions at a rail station down the line, of American units pulling back in confusion, of a tank destroyer unit abandoning a position nearby without orders. The picture forming in Buch's mind bore no resemblance to the quiet, restful sector he had been told to hold. Something enormous was moving toward them, and it was moving fast. Then, in the gray light of that December morning, Buch raised his binoculars and saw them. A column of German soldiers, marching in formation down the road that ran directly toward his position, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who expected no resistance at all. He began to count, and the number climbed past anything his mind wanted to accept. Not a patrol, not a platoon, something closer to an entire battalion, several hundred men strong, walking straight into the sights of 18 American soldiers that nobody at headquarters believed were in any danger at all. Buch got on the radio to report what he was seeing. The voice that answered him did not believe it either. Nobody, it seemed, was prepared to accept what one 20-year-old lieutenant with a pair of field glasses was telling them, that several hundred German soldiers were marching toward a hillside held by fewer men than a single American rifle platoon, usually fielded at half strength. He had two choices in that moment, and both of them terrified him in different ways. He could order his platoon to withdraw, to slip away into the forest and let the German column pass unopposed toward objectives that Buch could not yet begin to guess at. Or he could stay and fight, with 18 men and 4 artillery observers, against a force that outnumbered them by something close to 20-1, in a position that had never been designed to survive a determined assault, let alone stop one. There was no order telling him to hold at all costs. There was, if anything, every reasonable justification to leave. Lyle Buch looked at the column moving toward Lanzerath, looked at the men in the foxholes around him, men he had trained and eaten with and come to know better than his own family in the months since forming this platoon, and he made his decision. They would stay. They would let the Germans come into range, and they would fight. Behind him, somewhere far to the east, in a headquarters that had not yet begun to understand what a single delayed hour on a single insignificant ridge might cost an entire offensive, German staff officers were finalizing a timetable that assumed the road through Lanzerath would be clear and moving by mid-morning. It was a timetable built on the assumption that 18 American soldiers, unsupported, outnumbered, and holding a position nobody thought worth defending, would do exactly what military logic said they should do: run. Buch called it in twice before anyone believed him. He counted again to be sure of his own eyes, and the number held. Something close to 500 men, moving down the road out of Lanzerath in column formation. The leading elements of the 1st Battalion, 9th Parachute Regiment, part of the 3rd Parachute Division, an elite German force that had spent months training for exactly this kind of breakthrough operation. Their commander, an experienced officer named von Hoffmann, had been told the sector ahead was empty, or nearly so. A German reconnaissance element had passed through the village earlier that morning and reported no sign of American resistance. It was, on paper, meant to be the easiest stretch of the entire offensive to clear. The men coming down that road had every reason to believe this would not be a fight at all. They were tired from marching most of the night. They were carrying heavy loads of ammunition and equipment for an offensive expected to move fast and far, and they had been told, by officers who trusted a hasty and incomplete reconnaissance report, that the road ahead was theirs for the taking. What they did not know was that 18 American soldiers were watching them from the high ground above the village through the crosshairs of carefully sighted machine guns, and that the man commanding those 18 soldiers had spent the better part of a week walking every foot of his position, assigning exact fields of fire, making sure every weapon in his platoon covered a specific stretch of open ground with no gaps left for an attacker to exploit. It was not luck that determined what happened next. It was preparation, married to nerve. The Germans reached the edge of the village and began moving up the exposed slope toward the American positions, still walking rather than running, still behaving like men who expected no resistance. Bulge let them close the distance. He wanted them well within range before the first shot was fired, wanted the maximum possible number of enemy soldiers caught in the open with nowhere to take cover, because 18 men firing at extreme range against 500 was suicide. But 18 men opening fire at close range against a column strung out on an exposed hillside was something else entirely. It was, in the cold calculation of infantry tactics, a killing ground. The order came and the hillside erupted. Technical Sergeant Slape would later describe what he saw in that first burst of fire as one of the most beautiful fields of fire he had ever witnessed in his life. An observation that sounds strange coming from a man describing the start of a battle that would leave hundreds of casualties on the frozen ground below him, but which makes a grim kind of sense once you understand what he meant. Every weapon in the platoon had a clear, unobstructed line onto German soldiers caught completely in the open, with no folds in the terrain to hide behind and no time to organize a coordinated response. Machine guns raked the length of the column. Rifle fire picked off men trying to scramble for whatever cover the frozen ground offered. The German advance, so confident only moments before, collapsed within what survivors would later describe as less than a minute. German survivors of that first minute later described a strange disorientation in the middle of it, the sensation of an ambush so complete and so precisely timed that it felt, in the words one paratrooper gave during a post-war interview, as though the hillside itself had opened fire on them. Men trained for months in the aggressive doctrine of Germany's airborne forces, accustomed to moving fast and trusting speed and violence of action to carry them through any resistance, found themselves instead flattened against frozen ground, with nowhere to advance and nowhere safe to retreat, caught in the open by a defense so thoroughly prepared that individual soldiers could not tell how many Americans were actually shooting at them. Some estimated, in the confusion of that first minute, that they were facing a company or more, not 18 men spread along a ridgeline with carefully overlapping fields of fire. The illusion of overwhelming numbers was, in its own way, as much a weapon as the machine guns themselves, born entirely out of discipline and preparation, rather than any advantage in manpower Bulge's platoon did not actually possess. It should have ended there, from the German perspective a bloody but minor setback, the kind of thing an experienced battalion reorganizes from and tries again within the hour, using better tactics and heavier support. And that is exactly what von Hoffmann's officers attempted. They pulled their shattered lead elements back into whatever cover the village and the tree line offered, brought forward additional troops, and organized a second assault, this time supported by heavier automatic weapons fire aimed at suppressing the American positions long enough for infantry to close the distance. The second assault fared no better than the first. Bulge's men, dug into positions that offered real protection against small arms fire, held their nerve and their fire discipline, waiting again until the attacking Germans were fully committed and exposed before opening up with everything they had. Ammunition was a concern from the very start. 18 men could not sustain unlimited rates of fire indefinitely, but in these early hours it was still the German attackers who were paying the higher price by an order of magnitude that must have seemed almost unbelievable to the officers coordinating the assault from the rear. By mid-morning, something remarkable happened in the middle of the fighting. German medics, working under a hastily arranged and unofficial pause in the shooting, moved out into the open ground below the American position to retrieve their wounded. Bulge held his fire and ordered his men to do the same. It was not required by any order from above, and it cost his platoon nothing in tactical terms to grant, but it revealed something about the character of the men making these decisions on both sides of the firing line. Soldiers who, even in the chaos of an enormous offensive meant to reshape the entire war in the West, still recognized a shared and basic humanity in the middle of trying to kill each other. The pause lasted only as long as it took the German medics to carry away as many of the wounded as they could reach, and then the fighting resumed with the same intensity as before. From their foxholes, several of Bulge's men would later describe the strange quality of that lull, watching enemy soldiers who, minutes earlier, had been trying to kill them, now bent low over the frozen ground, gathering their wounded comrades with a kind of desperate tenderness that had nothing to do with the war raging around them. Corporal Aubrey McGehee, manning one of the platoon's automatic weapons, held his fire alongside every other man on the ridge, watching the enemy below through his sights without pulling the trigger, an act of restraint that cost nothing tactically and yet demanded something from each of them all the same. It did not last. It was never going to last, but for those few minutes, the war on that hillside paused just long enough to remember it was still, underneath everything, being fought by human beings. Word of what was happening on that ridge began to travel back through the German chain of command, and it did not travel well. An entire battalion, stalled for hours by a position that reconnaissance had reported as empty, was not a minor local difficulty. It was a crisis with consequences reaching far beyond one Belgian hillside. Somewhere behind the stalled column, an armored task force under the command of an SS officer named Joachim Peiper was waiting for this exact road to open, the spearhead of an entire panzer division whose mission depended on speed above almost everything else, racing against a timetable that had no room in it for an unexpected delay caused by 18 American soldiers nobody had known were there. When Peiper learned what was happening, and how little his subordinates actually knew about the strength of the position blocking his route, witnesses would later describe him as furious in a way that went beyond ordinary battlefield frustration. This was not how the opening days of the offensive were supposed to unfold. Peiper had built his reputation on speed, on a ruthless willingness to push armored columns forward through terrain and resistance that more cautious commanders would have paused to reduce first, and his entire mission depended on reaching the Meuse River before American reinforcements could organize a coherent defense. Every hour lost on this road was an hour the Allies gained to react, to reinforce, to close the gap that the entire German plan depended on tearing open before anyone on the other side understood what was happening. According to accounts from officers who served under him, Peiper's anger at the delay boiled over into open contempt for the reconnaissance failures that had left his spearhead stalled behind a battalion that could not clear a single defended hillside. He is said to have demanded direct command of a battalion himself. So convinced was he that the paratroopers in front of him were mishandling what should have been a straightforward assault. Whether or not he ever personally rode forward to assess the situation at Lanzerath, the fury attributed to him in post-war testimony captures something essential about what those 18 Americans had accomplished without ever knowing it. They were not merely delaying a local infantry battalion. They were holding up the point of the spear for one of the most consequential armored thrusts of the entire German offensive, an SS panzer column whose success or failure in the coming days would help determine whether Hitler's gamble in the Ardennes had any chance of succeeding at all. Back on the hillside, the third German assault of the day came in early afternoon, and it came with a harder edge than the two before it. Von Hoffmann's men had learned something from their failures, adjusting their approach, trying to use what little cover the terrain offered, and pressing the attack with the kind of grim determination that comes from officers who understand that failure is no longer an acceptable outcome to report up the chain. Mortar fire fell more accurately on the American positions. Small arms fire from multiple directions began probing for weaknesses in a defensive line that had, until now, held with almost eerie completeness. Inside the American foxholes, the strain was becoming visible in ways that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with the simple physics of combat. Ammunition, carried in by 18 men and 4 artillery observers who had expected a quiet observation post rather than a full day of sustained combat, was running low. Some positions had already exhausted their supply of grenades. Machine gun barrels, fired for hours without the kind of relief a properly supplied position would have allowed, were approaching the limits of what they could safely sustain. And still the third assault came on, wave after wave of German soldiers pressing up the same exposed slope that had already claimed so many of their comrades that morning. Along the American line, individual soldiers were fighting their own private battles against fatigue and diminishing supply as much as against the enemy in front of them. Private John Kreger shifted position twice during the third assault to cover a gap left by a wounded man, firing from a hastily improvised spot with none of the protection his original foxhole had offered. Private Louis Khalil, down to his last several clips of ammunition, made every shot count in a way that would later earn him formal recognition for valor, picking his targets with the discipline of a man who understood that wasted rounds now might mean an empty rifle within the hour. Private First Class Jordan Robinson and Private James Silvola worked their section of the line together, passing ammunition between positions as supplies dwindled, each man covering the other through gaps in fire that neither could have managed alone. None of them had been trained, in any formal sense, for a sustained defensive battle against odds this lopsided. The intelligence and reconnaissance platoon existed to observe and report, not to anchor a defensive line against an entire battalion. And yet here they were, fighting with the discipline of veteran infantry, because the alternative, retreat through open ground under fire, offered no better chance of survival than holding where they stood. Lieutenant Warren Springer, the artillery observer attached to Buch's platoon, worked his radio throughout the fighting, calling in what fire support he could coordinate onto the German positions forming up in the village below. It was dangerous, exposed work, adjusting artillery fire while under direct enemy observation, and it added another layer of lethality to a defense that German officers were beginning to suspect was more than the isolated platoon their reconnaissance had promised them. Springer's radio calls that day carried a strange, clipped formality even as the battle around him grew more chaotic by the hour. The practiced language of a man trained to communicate grid coordinates and adjustments under fire without letting his voice betray the fear that any reasonable person in his position would have felt. Beside him, Sergeant Peter Gackey and Technician 5th Grade Willard Wibben kept the equipment running and the observations flowing, three men whose entire function on that ridge had been to watch and report rather than to fight, now fully absorbed into a defensive stand none of them had trained for. It was Springer's coordination more than any single rifle or machine gun on the hillside that turned scattered German formations gathering in the village below into targets for artillery fire from guns positioned miles away, a reach that 18 infantrymen with small arms alone could never have achieved. The cost of this defense was mounting steadily on the American side as the day wore on, even if it remained nowhere close to proportional to what the Germans were suffering below. Man after man in Buch's platoon took a wound and kept fighting anyway, because there was nowhere safer to retreat to, and because the alternative, a gap in the line, might be the opening the next German assault needed to finally break through. By the time the third assault had been broken and thrown back, more than half the platoon had been wounded in one way or another, some seriously enough that only sheer stubbornness kept them at their positions, rather than falling back to whatever aid could be improvised behind the line. There was no field hospital nearby. There was no realistic evacuation route. There was only the ridge, the cold, and the next wave of German soldiers that everyone on that hillside understood was still coming. Buch moved along his line throughout the afternoon, checking positions, redistributing ammunition where he could, and projecting a calm that his men would later credit as much as any tactical decision for holding the platoon together through hours of sustained combat that would have broken far larger and more experienced units. He crawled from foxhole to foxhole low against the frozen ground, exchanging a few words with each man, confirming ammunition counts, checking on the wounded who had refused evacuation, and each time he moved on, the soldier he left behind seemed to sit a little straighter, hold his weapon a little steadier, ready for whatever came next, simply because their lieutenant had looked them in the eye and had not looked afraid. He understood, even as the fighting wore on, that his presence and his composure mattered as much to the men beside him as any order he could give. A frightened 18-year-old private in a foxhole, hearing mortar rounds walking closer with every salvo, needed to see his lieutenant behaving as though this was, however terrible, a situation that could still be managed. The third assault broke against the American position, just as the first two had, though at a cost to both sides that was mounting with every passing hour. German casualties on the slope below Lanzerath were climbing into numbers that would, by the end of the day, be estimated by different accounts at anywhere from several dozen to several hundred, killed, wounded, and missing. A staggering toll for an attack that had been expected to clear the position within half an hour of first contact. American casualties were mounting too. Of the 18 men in Bulge's platoon, more than half would eventually be wounded before the day was finished, though remarkably, through hours of continuous combat against an enemy that outnumbered them by something close to 20-1, only a single American life had been lost. An artillery observer named Billy Queen, struck down while helping coordinate the fire support that had done so much to blunt the German assaults. As the afternoon wore into its final hours, a strange stalemate settled over the ridge above Lanzerath. The Germans, having launched 3 costly assaults directly into prepared American positions, understood by now that a frontal approach along the road was not going to succeed, not without a change in tactics, or a commitment of forces that von Hoffmann's superiors were increasingly unwilling to authorize, given how badly the timetable had already slipped. And Bulge's men, exhausted, low on ammunition, several of them wounded but still holding their positions, understood that the day was not over yet, that the quiet settling over the battlefield in the fading afternoon light was not surrender but reconsideration, and that whatever came next would likely come from a direction they had not yet been forced to defend. Somewhere in the trees to the south and east of the American position, a different German unit, drawn from a Volksgrenadier division, moving up in support of the stalled paratroopers, was beginning to work its way around the flank of the ridge, probing for the kind of vulnerability that a direct assault straight up an open slope had failed 3 times to find. 18 men could cover a great deal of ground when their fields of fire were carefully planned and ruthlessly disciplined. But 18 men could not be everywhere at once, and the forest wrapping around their position offered exactly the kind of concealment that a flanking force needed to close the distance unseen. Bach knew this danger existed even as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, throwing long shadows across a slope littered with the evidence of an entire day's failed assaults. His men had held against everything sent directly up that hill since dawn. What none of them yet knew was whether they could hold against what was coming next, quietly, through the trees, from a direction the day's fighting had left them dangerously unprepared to defend. The temperature dropped further as the light faded, and the men in the foxholes, already exhausted from a full day of continuous combat, began to feel the particular kind of cold that settles into a body running on adrenaline and almost nothing else. Rations had gone largely untouched since before dawn. Water in canteens had frozen hours earlier. Hands that had spent the day working rifle bolts and machine gun triggers were now stiff and slow, in a way that worried every man who noticed it in himself. And beneath the exhaustion sat a quieter, more persistent fear, the awareness that the platoon had used most of what it carried up that hill, and that whatever came next would have to be met with whatever remained. Radio traffic back to regimental headquarters grew more urgent as the afternoon wore into evening. Bulge reported his situation as clearly as the confusion of the day allowed, requesting whatever support could be spared, though the truth settling over the ridge was one that no radio message could fully soften. Reinforcement, if it came at all, was unlikely to arrive before dark, and the position his platoon held, however brilliantly it had performed against 3 direct assaults, had never been built to withstand a coordinated attack from more than one direction at once. Somewhere out there in the deepening shadows of the forest, an enemy that had failed 3 times head-on was already looking for the one approach nobody on that hillside had been forced to defend yet. Darkness came early in the Ardennes in December, and with it came the attack Bulge had feared since mid-afternoon. German soldiers from a different unit, moving up in support of the stalled paratroopers, had spent the fading light working their way through the forest to the south and east of the ridge, screened by trees and the deepening gloom from the American positions that had spent the entire day watching the road and the open slope in front of them. When the attack came, it came from a direction the platoon had never been able to fully cover, catching exhausted men in positions built to defend against a frontal assault, not an approach through their own back door. The line began to come apart, not because the men defending it lost their nerve, but because a position designed for 18 men to watch one approach could not simultaneously defend against an enemy appearing from another. Foxholes fell in sequence as German soldiers moved through gaps in the perimeter that daylight and better numbers might have closed. Buch, moving to try to organize some kind of coordinated withdrawal before the position collapsed entirely, found himself with almost no time left to act. The plan, if it could be called that in the chaos of the moment, was a simple signal, a whistle blast that would tell the platoon to fall back toward whatever cover remained. He never got the chance to give it. A German soldier reached Buch's position before he could react, weapon raised, and pulled the trigger at point-blank range. The gun jammed. In the strange arithmetic of survival that runs through so many accounts of close combat, that single mechanical failure, a rifle that should have fired and did not, was the difference between a young lieutenant living to tell this story and becoming another name added to the day's casualty list. In the scramble that followed, shots were fired. The German officer confronting Buch was seriously wounded, and Buch himself took a bullet to the leg. Moments later, a German sergeant reached the position and demanded to know who was in command. When Buch identified himself, the sergeant asked why the Americans were still firing. Buch told him honestly that his men were not the ones responsible for the shots still echoing across the position in the confusion of the moment. Whatever the sergeant made of that answer, the fighting on the ridge above Lanzerath was, for all practical purposes, over. One by one, the surviving members of the platoon were rounded up and disarmed. 14 of the 18 men had taken wounds of some kind over the course of the day, several of them serious enough to require immediate attention that their German captors, exhausted themselves from a day of costly and repeated failure, were not necessarily inclined to provide with any urgency. Buch, wounded in the leg and barely able to walk, helped carry some of his more seriously injured men down toward the village his platoon had spent the entire day defending against, now as a prisoner rather than a defender. The walk down from the ridge into the village was slow and painful, wounded men leaning on comrades who were themselves barely standing, all of them passing along the way the visible evidence of what their single day of resistance had cost the attacking force. Equipment abandoned in the road, the aftermath of 3 assaults that had gone almost nowhere. Nobody among the prisoners felt anything like triumph in that moment. What they felt, almost universally in later accounts, was simple exhaustion, the kind that settles into the bones once the adrenaline of survival finally has nowhere left to go. They were herded first into a building in Lanzerath itself, a small cafe at the crossroads that had, only hours earlier, sat directly behind the German assembly area for the attacks that had failed so completely against the ridge above it. It was there, sometime around midnight, surrounded by his wounded men and guarded by soldiers who had just spent an entire day trying to kill him, that Lyle Buch turned 21 years old. There was no celebration. There was barely acknowledgement. One of his men, badly wounded and fading in and out of consciousness nearby, was in critical enough condition that survival itself seemed uncertain through the night. Whatever birthday Buch might have imagined for himself before the war, this was not it. A concrete floor, the smell of blood and gun oil, and the low murmur of German soldiers moving past a group of prisoners who, 12 hours earlier, none of them had believed could possibly still be alive. What followed in the days and weeks after capture tested the survivors in ways that combat, for all its terror, had not. The wounded and unwounded alike were eventually loaded onto railroad cars, the same kind of enclosed freight cars used to transport livestock, packed far beyond any reasonable capacity, with little food, little water, and no meaningful medical care for men who had been carrying open wounds for days by the time the trains began to move. Conditions inside grew steadily worse as the journey stretched on. By the time Christmas arrived, several men who had survived an entire day of direct combat against overwhelming numbers had died in the cramped, freezing confines of the boxcars, victims not of enemy fire but of exhaustion, blood loss, and the sheer physical toll of captivity under conditions that violated every standard of humane treatment. Those who survived the journey were scattered among several prisoner-of-war camps in the following months, some held in makeshift facilities so overcrowded that men designed to hold a few hundred prisoners found themselves packed with well over 1,000. Malnutrition became a constant companion. News from the outside world arrived in fragments, if at all, and for months the fate of the platoon remained largely unknown, even to the American command that had, in the chaos of the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge, lost track of exactly what had happened to 18 men who had simply stopped reporting in after the 16th of December. Some accounts of the fighting that day were credited, in the confusion of after-action reporting, to other units entirely, an error that would take years and considerable effort from the men themselves to correct. By the time the camps were liberated in the final weeks of the war in Europe, the men who had once been a full-strength platoon of 18 soldiers and 4 attached artillery observers were, in many cases, barely recognizable versions of the men who had gone into those foxholes above Lanzerath 5 months earlier. Bulge himself was hospitalized for an extended period after his release, too weak from months of captivity and malnutrition to immediately provide the detailed combat report that military procedure would ordinarily have required of a platoon leader almost as soon as the fighting ended. And that delay, more than any deliberate decision to overlook what had happened on that ridge, became part of why the story of Lanzerath faded so quickly from official memory. There was no timely after-action report filed in the days immediately following the battle. There was no citation written while the details were fresh in the minds of officers who might otherwise have pushed the paperwork through the recognition process quickly. Instead, there was a gap, months long, during which an extraordinary defensive stand simply disappeared into the enormous and chaotic historical record of the Battle of the Bulge, one obscure engagement among thousands, its true significance buried under an avalanche of larger battles fought in the same general offensive. It would take decades, and the tireless personal effort of Lyle Bulge himself, digging through archives and tracking down surviving witnesses, and pressing a case that the United States Army had been too slow and too disorganized to make on its own, before the full picture of what those 18 men had accomplished finally received official recognition. In October of 1981, 36 years after the battle, the surviving members of the platoon and the attached artillery observers were formally decorated, the Distinguished Service Cross for some, the Silver Star and Bronze Star for others, a presidential unit citation recognizing the platoon as a whole. It remains, by the account of military historians who have studied the action closely, among the most decorated small units of its size in the entire history of the United States Army in the Second World War, a distinction earned not in a single dramatic charge, but in an entire day of disciplined, desperate, unglamorous defense against odds that should, by any reasonable calculation, have overwhelmed them within the first half hour. The strategic consequences of that single day reached far beyond the 18 men who lived through it. The delay imposed on the German advance through Lanzerath, roughly 20 hours by the time Kampfgruppe Peiper's armored column finally rolled through the village in the early hours of the following morning, arrived at a moment when every hour mattered enormously to an offensive whose entire premise depended on speed and surprise. 20 hours meant 20 more hours for American forces elsewhere along the front to recognize the scale of what was happening, to organize resistance, to move reinforcements into positions that would go on to blunt and eventually reverse the German offensive over the following weeks. No single platoon could claim to have decided the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge on its own, but few individual actions on that first chaotic day did more, in proportion to their size, to disrupt the timetable an entire German army group had built its hopes upon. A German officer once sat down to write an after-action report explaining how 3 assaults, backed by hundreds of men, had failed against a position held by a fraction of their number. He never fully found the words for what he had witnessed on that hillside. Perhaps the simplest explanation is also the truest one. 18 young men, most of them barely out of their teens, decided together that a ridge above a village they had never heard of before that week was worth holding, and then they held it, for an entire day, against everything an empire at the height of its final desperate gamble could throw at them. They were not supposed to be there. They were not supposed to fight. And when the history of that offensive is finally measured in full, it is hard to find 18 men anywhere in the war whose ordinary courage, sustained hour after hour under conditions designed to break it, changed quite so much.